Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining part 3 in our 4-part webinar series on climate finance. Please note this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on climatelinks.org in the coming weeks. If you have a question for any of our speakers today, please use the Q&A button to add your question to the queue. Once again, as folks are joining us, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining part 3 in this 4-part webinar series on climate finance. Once again, please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on climatelinks.org in the coming weeks. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A button to add your question to the queue. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Maria Ruiz Sierra, to kick us off.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hi, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion. As mentioned, I am Maria. I'm part of the Climate Policy Initiatives team. I lead there the Latin America and the Caribbean program of the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and I support CPI's innovative finance work more broadly, with a particular focus on nature-based solutions and the transition to sustainable land use and agricultural practices. So I'm super excited to get to be here today with you and with this very valuable group of speakers. This is the third webinar of a series on demystifying climate finance that aims to highlight and share insights from USAID's Climate Finance Working Group, as was mentioned. And today we will focus our attention on financing climate adaptation solutions in agriculture, which is a critical piece to achieve both climate goals, but also development and biodiversity goals. We are already facing the multiple effects of climate change, from intense floods in East Africa a couple of months ago to droughts and wildfires in Brazil just a couple of days ago and ongoing. And we're witnessing how they are becoming more and more frequent and widespread around the world. And in this context, agricultural producers are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change and changing weather patterns. The consequences include crop losses, shifting growing seasons, further soil degradation, growing pests and diseases, among others. And these challenges particularly affect small and medium farmers, who are responsible for the majority of global agricultural production and depend on it as its primary or sole source of income. This means that deploying climate adaptation and resilience measures across our agri-food systems is crucial to ensure food security, but also the livelihoods of millions of people around the world. Additionally, agriculture is also key for achieving global climate mitigation goals. The AFOLU sector, agriculture, forest, and land use, is responsible for between 13 and 21% of global emissions. And agri-food systems more broadly, including the downstream chain of transport, retail, and consumption, accounts for 34% of total global emissions. So over a third of emissions come from the agricultural sector. It also plays a significant role in economic activity, as it provides over a quarter of all jobs globally, the majority of which are in low to middle income countries. And as an activity that accounts for over 38% of global land use, the way that we're doing it also has a significant impact in land use change and biodiversity loss. So all of this underscores the urgent need that we have to transition our agri-food systems to low carbon, more resilient, nature positive models that can protect and regenerate the ecosystem on which they depend, and also the people that are deploying and undertaking this activity. While investments in climate finance to agri-food system sectors has grown over the past decade, it still only represented 4% of total climate finance tracked between 2009 and 2020, according to CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance, and falls significantly short to be consistent with climate goals, requiring a nearly 13-fold increase in annual funding in a conservative scenario. Out of the total climate financing for the sector, only around a fifth get to small and medium-sized farmers. And although this financing gap continues to be large, at least the majority of current investments are focusing on adaptation and dual-purpose solutions in known OECD countries, which is aligned with the purpose of allocating the resources where they're most needed. An overwhelming majority of current tract finance for agri-food systems originates from public sector, with philanthropies providing a small fraction of the identified private sector financing. So in this sense, we also need to crowd in private funding, de-risk these investments, and make it viable for private investors. And blended finance structures, for instance, are a mechanism to do that and unlock private financing. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. We have three extraordinary speakers that will share with us some very interesting perspectives and examples around how to demystify and accelerate exactly this climate adaptation financing in the agricultural sector. So we have with us today Dan Suk, Executive Director of ISF Advisors, Rebecca Mincy, Investment Director of the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, and Tony Shiaka, Private Sector Investment Manager of the Rwanda Green Fund. Now to begin, I'll turn it over to Dan, and he will presenting us some insights around the report titled Climate Adaptation Finance for Agriculture, Donor and Investor Guidance, and will shed light on some of the best practices to identify and measure investment opportunities in adaptation in agriculture. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Maria. Great to be here with you all today. So I'm Dan Zook. I'm the Executive Director of ISF Advisors. We're essentially a research and strategic financial advisory team that is focused on mobilizing investment capital into sustainable, resilient, more inclusive food systems. And we do that through a combination of research and financial advisory. And we recently did some research on climate adaptation in agriculture that I'm going to share with you today. So Maria already hit these figures from Climate Policy Initiative, but here you can just visually see the huge gap in climate adaptation finance in particular. If you look at all climate finance, agri-food systems only get about 4%, despite, as Maria said, being a third of emissions. And from a resiliency and adaptation point of view, smallholder farmers are the most vulnerable population in the world. And of the money climate money that's going to agri-food systems, it's only a sliver of that that's going to adaptation. And again, this is mostly public finance that is going. There's very, very little private finance, private investment finance going into adaptation. And there's various estimates of the investment required in order to adapt our food system to be more resilient, but it's going to require at least a 7x increase in annual financing in order to get there. So with this in mind, we were commissioned by, actually both by the Gates Foundation and by USAID to do two reports in parallel. The one on the left here, you can think of it as a landscape of investment opportunities in adaptation. So the lens or the audience for that report is primarily for investors looking for opportunities. The report on the right here was commissioned by USAID through the Market Systems and Partnerships activity. And the audience here is donors who are looking to influence, incentivize, catalyze investors in order to invest more in climate adaptation solutions. So the reports are very complementary and they build on one another, but they are technically two different reports. I'm going to share highlights of each today, and you can find both of them on our website at isfadvisors.org/research. So why is it hard to invest in adaptation in agriculture? When we talked to a number of investors and other stakeholders, they said there are 5 themes that came up a lot. Number one was a lack of definition. What is adaptation? We talked to a lot of commercial investors, and you talk about climate adaptation, they start telling you about their mitigation strategies. So it's just an awareness of what adaptation means is not always there. And then there's different definitions. Some take a very tight definition, some take a very loose definition. For example, just increasing incomes can be considered an adaptation resiliency because that increases your adaptive capacity, even if you're not doing something that's specifically responding to, say, using water more efficiently. Secondly, there are varying taxonomies. In fact, as we released our reports, there was sort of a flurry of reports that came out at the same time. So there's clearly a desire in the market to have a clearer taxonomy around what is meant by adaptation. And in our report, we went through all of the existing ones and kind of broke them down. Fortunately, even though there are different taxonomies, a lot of them I found have similar kind of fundamental principles that they're working around. Third is high risk. I mean, agriculture is already a risky sector to invest in with generally low margins. And so you layer climate on top of that, and climate adaptation in particular, which is often about protecting downside risk more so than increasing yields. and the risks are even higher. That can make it an area that's hard to invest in. Fourth is context specificity. What is adaptation in Ethiopia is different than what is adaptation in Guatemala. If you're in a drought-prone or a flood-prone region, the solutions vary. And so there's no one-size-fits-all solution for adaptation that you can that cross-cuts the globe. And so you have to adapt what you're investing in by the region, often inter-country as well. And then there's diverse funding needs. So there's many different kinds of businesses, and they need different kinds of capital ranging from grant to commercial. And they also often are fairly early stage, and they have long payback times, which investors can shy away from if they're risk averse. So despite that, there are investors that are finding deals in adaptation. And so this report we did on behalf of the Gates Foundation, we partnered up with AgFunder. AgFunder, in addition to being a fund, is also a news outlet that tracks deals in the ag tech space. And so we were curious, how many of those deals in the last 10 years were climate adaptation deals. And so we started by doing a keyword search for climate adaptation in their database, and we only found two deals that were specifically mentioned climate adaptation. But again, that comes back to the definition. There's a lot of deals that don't call themselves climate adaptation, but could be considered. And so through a very kind of exhaustive methodology that I won't explain in detail, but you can read in the appendix, we essentially did a natural language search. So if you type into Google and you search for Nike, you're also going to get Adidas and Reebok and other shoe companies. We did a similar kind of thing with terms related to climate adaptation, and we found 1,500 deals over the last 10 years, totaling $5.7 billion, so approximately $500 million per year. And those were for 700 unique companies with a median deal size of about $1.7 million. Keep in mind we were looking mostly at venture deals. So this wouldn't include like deals that large companies are doing, or even lending by banks necessarily. This is mostly kind of venture and private equity deals. But it's still representative of the types of things that people are investing in adaptation. Interestingly, about 14% of the deals were through corporate venture capital arms, particularly out of Indonesia and Malaysia and Israel. DFIs are quite active. You have FMO, the Israel Innovation Authority, FinFund, and that's not CDC anymore, but BII, who have done a lot of deals. And that's only their direct deals. Keep in mind that FMO, BII, a lot of them are investing in funds that are then investing in solutions. So BII investing in Omnivore, for example, and Omnivore was actually the top investor that we found in the space. Also interesting, about 14% of the companies that had received investment had received grant money or some other kind of support prior to receiving investment money. So that just highlights the need for the kind of concessional money in the early days of getting these businesses started. Now, just to clarify a few things, we were basically looking for companies that are providing solutions to smallholder farmers in developing countries. The companies themselves could be based in emerging markets themselves, or they could be based in Europe or North America, but offering us a significant portion of their services to smallholder farmers. So that was the primary lens for what we were looking for here. It's not necessarily, this is not finance for farmers directly. This is financing for the businesses that provide adaptation solutions. Now, what kind of solutions were they providing? Our report goes into quite a bit of detail about that, and you can see the trends over time. But basically, to break it down into 6 themes that we saw, there's sort of 6 opportunities for investors. One is the on-farm and post-farm infrastructure. Companies like Sun Culture doing irrigation, EcoZen, anything around kind of cold chain and that infrastructure to make the value chain and the farm more resilient and adaptive. The second theme was adapted inputs, making more drought resilient sort of biotechnology around seed technologies that would be more adaptive, companies like Puna Bio and String. The third theme was around the enabling data intelligence, taking satellite data, weather data, farm data, combining that together in order to make better on-farm decisions, either for farmers themselves or for players in the value chain, or oftentimes for the financial institutions that are serving the farmers and looking to mitigate their risk. The fourth category, pretty big one, is financial services writ large, and that's a big category. Financial services would include, banks that are lending directly. It would also include fintech, and there's a lot of fast-growing fintech companies, or ag fintech in particular in this space. It would also include insurance, which is a big theme here. The fifth category is a bit of a catch-all, but it's we call them the climate adaptive supply chain connectors. So this is the midstream companies that are engaging farmers in some way to make them more resilient. So Rebecca can probably tell you in a minute about Tomato Joss, which was an investment by Acumen's Resilient Ag Fund. Now, Tomato Joss is a tomato processing company, tomato canning, which wouldn't naturally suggest that it's a resilient investment, but the investment that was used from Acumen to Tomato Joss was used to engage farmers in more resilient practices. And therefore, in that case, that investment would be considered a climate adaptation investment. And the sixth category is agriculture marketplaces. These are, you can think of like the Amazon.com of agriculture, companies like Dahat and IFEX in Nigeria that are being a kind of a middle ground, a trading place between farmers and the various services that they need in order to be more resilient and adaptive. You'll find in the report, we have a chapter on each of these six, including the top 10 deals in that space. You can find a lot more detail in the report. I'm going to pivot now to the second report, the one that was funded by USAID. So based on the insights we got from the Gates report around opportunities to invest in adaptation, USAID wanted to know, okay, how can we promote more of this? Because there's some happening, but we need more. And how can donors support that? And so what we were trying to do is come up with the equivalent of like a 2X initiative. Like, how could you define what is an investment, in adaptation? And we found it's actually pretty hard, mainly because the context varies so much. We did come up with a set of principles that a donor can use in order to assess funds that are investing in adaptation. And the first set of criteria is around context and geography. So ideally, you want to be looking for funds that are investing in high priority regions that are very vulnerable to climate change, and funds that really understand the local context. So ideally, they're using science-based climate risk assessments. They've used some kind of index of vulnerable countries, and ideally, they have a local presence or at least deep experience within their fund team in that geography, so that they're able to assess the opportunities in a local context. The second set of criteria is around a solutions-led approach. Does the fund invest in and use science-driven adaptation practices? Now, you can look on the FAO and other places, and you can find huge lists of solutions that would be considered adaptation. And so you want to start with that science-based approach, and then again, inform it in a local context to ensure it's addressing the local needs. And we profile a whole bunch of frameworks that you can look up from FAO, from Lightsmith ASAP framework, or the UNCTCN taxonomies that help you guide around different kinds of solutions that are appropriate in different contexts. But ultimately, a donor needs to think about what their own theory of change is, and then align their support for investors around that. The third category is intentionality and additionality. Of course, this is the holy grail for impact investing and how you define intentionality and additionality. We talk about it quite a bit in the report, building on various taxonomies that are already out there. But essentially, you want to be looking at funds that have intentionality, like they've are specifically looking for opportunities in climate adaptation. And secondly, that the funds have some kind of additionality framework. Because if you're a donor and you're bringing concessional money in, you want to make sure you're not doing something that the private market is going to do already. So you ideally want to align with something like the investment management projects, investor contribution strategies, or the harmonized framework for additionality from the MDB framework. Now, another thing that donors think about a lot is assessing impact, and impact investors are thinking about this too. Rebecca actually is a great resource for this because Acumen's fund has been very thoughtful. But we found, looking at different funds investing in adaptation, they tend to have 4 layers of depth around how they think about impact. At the highest layer, and probably the easiest layer, is just measuring the reach of impact. How many farmers, how many hectares, what value of assets were the 3 most common metrics that people are measuring. To go a layer deeper, you think about proxy metrics. If you've got a specific theory of change, say around water use, then you can come up with proxy metrics that address that specific theory of change, such as total water consumed or the cubic meters of water conserved. Now, the next layer deeper is to actually get to the beneficiaries, the customers, those who are using these technologies, and find out, is their perception of adaptation and resilience stronger? Do they feel like they can adapt to the situation better now that they have this technology? And so organizations like 60 Decibels will go out and interview households and ask them, do you feel more prepared for an unexpected weather event? And of course, the final layer, but also the most expensive layer, is to look at the results of actual shocks. So 60 Decibels also will go in and look at post a shock, how did that family respond to the shock with the technology that they had? And my final page here is just around different ways that donors can use their grant money, their concessional money to support investors. And this is what we were hearing from different investors saying that, wow, it'd be great if donors provided more kind of ecosystem support in these different areas. One, on the demand side, is just supporting more investment around some of the areas and technologies where there's significant gaps. We were hearing in particular post-harvest management, precision agriculture, crop insurance, and that midstream infrastructure around cold chain and logistics have big needs, and also they're capital intensive and are going to need a lot of investment. Of course, the needs vary from geography and local context, so you have to keep that in mind. On supply side, there's addressing the fund level market gaps. There's a big need for climate risk assessments, and some investors are sponsoring these risk assessments themselves. But these risk assessments can be beneficial to all kinds of players. And so this could be an area for donors to step in, fund some of these climate risk assessments, and then avail that to multiple investors and stakeholders in a given geography. There's also a need for patient, flexible capital to accommodate the high risk and long time horizon of some of these investments. And I did think it was interesting in the Gates report that the median deal size is $1.7 million. That's quite small, and it's very expensive to do small ticket sizes. And so there's a need to support some of the costs and risks around investing in smaller ticket sizes. And then finally, in terms of ecosystem support, there's an opportunity to take a systems approach. Several investors mentioned that they're investing in these technologies, but only the wealthier farmers may have access to that. So without support for training and information for some of the more vulnerable farmers, they might not get access to some of these technologies. Similarly, there's an opportunity for just learning initiatives across the sector to share knowledge as we think about what is adaptation, learn from one another, have these platforms for investors to coordinate and learn from one another, and to coordinate with donors as well. And then finally, there are opportunities to fund a holistic suite of initiatives. Just because a farmer gets access to irrigation, that doesn't make the farmer resilient. There's a whole suite of things that need to happen, and not just for the farm, but probably in the community, in the value chain, in a landscape. And so donors can play that role of coordinating and thinking about what are the different gaps that investors aren't reaching in order to have a more holistic solution. So I'm going to pause there, and I think we'll go to a Q&A before we go to our next speaker.
Thank you, Dan. That was very insightful. And yes, we have received a couple of questions on the chat. Remember that if you have questions while the speakers are presenting, then you get a Q&A button and you can leave them there. So we have one specifically related to the financial mechanisms that allow producers to access green finance that are so they can finance their adaptation solutions that are suitable for them. And you mentioned that that was one of the perspectives of the existing investment. So if you can expand a bit on that, and what are the examples, and if it's actually capital what is needed, or what are the other enabling conditions that are relevant also to put in place, like the ones that you were mentioning at the end.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of financial services for the farmers, there's some pretty interesting things happening. The Green Climate Fund in particular has been doing some work, and Tony will speak to this on our panel as well, because he has a lot of experience. But Green Climate Fund supporting like NMB Bank, for example, in order to provide appropriate products and services to farmers. And sometimes it's a combination of having the appropriate product. Say for irrigation, having a product that matches the financing need and the tenor of that product, and then also sometimes there's need for like the patient and maybe even concessional capital in order to get the pricing right so that farmers can afford it. And I think we know that agriculture needs to be subsidized. I mean, agriculture is subsidized in every country in the world, and now when you bring in the climate adaptation lens, I think there's even more of an agenda around how do you provide some support to the financial system in order to make the financial product affordable and appropriate to what the farmer needs.
Thank you. And connected to that, another question that we received on the chat is, what will it take to attract more green finance for smart adaptations, especially green bonds? Are green bonds an interesting, suitable mechanism to leverage the necessary financing?
Yeah, I think green bonds are one in a suite of tools. I mean, I talked a lot about the venture capital funds and PE funds, which wouldn't be using green bonds. But when you think about the corporate channel, which we do talk about in the report, some of the larger corporates that are investing in their value chain, they can tap into green bonds, and especially at the in the sovereign side, governments need funding in order to support this transition, and so green bonds can be effective there. I
Perfect.
think
Thank you
actually
so
just
much.
one
Sorry.
more point I
Yeah.
make. I think it's about making the investment case, and so this report was sort of a first step in just saying, well, like, what is adaptation? What is the investment case? And showing that, hey, it is hard, but people are making money doing this. There is a case to be made, and so I think that's sort of the first step, is to just to get more awareness of what is adaptation and to make the business case for it.
That's super valid point. Also to leave the message that it's not that sometimes risks are higher in the perception than in the reality, and that there are ways to structure the financing mechanisms through blended finance or through asset classes that institutional investors already know, like green bonds, to build the case and to connect the dots. There are already tools in place. We just need to connect the dots and use it more smartly to leverage the capital at the scale that we needed, with the urgency that we needed. Thank you very much for your presentation. Super interesting. And everyone that is listening to us, you're very welcome to check the report, Climate Adaptation Finance for Agriculture, Donor and Investor Guidance, and you can have a lot more detail there. So now we
Thanks,
move
Maria.
on to the second presentation. We invite Rebecca Mincy. She's Investment Director of the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, ARAF, to present an overview of the fund and to share their approach to adaptation and some examples of successful investments. So welcome, Rebecca. Over to you. You have 10 minutes for the presentation.
Great, thank you. I've set my timer. I'll ask the your colleague to run with the slides for me. And while the slides are coming up, I'll just quickly reintroduce myself. Thanks, Lindsay. I'm Rebecca Mincy. I am the investment director for the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, and we were the world's first climate adaptation equity fund. We actually got started on this idea of investing in climate adaptation in 2017. So we've been at this for a little while. There wasn't really a script at the time. And so as I walk through what we do day in and day out with regard to the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, do pay attention to the architecture of the fund. There was a lot of intentionality there, and I think it really is kind of paid off as we have been investing in over the last, I guess we started investing in 2020, so over the last 4 years. Next slide. So essentially, we're a $58 million VC fund, and we invest in fast-growing agribusinesses that help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. A mouthful, but basically what we do is that we invest at the intersection of agriculture and climate change. In addition to investing in equity, we also have a technical assistance facility where we provide small grants to the companies that we invest in to pilot, to pivot, to do impact measurement, to move forward on ESG. We, as our name implies, we are sponsored by Acumen, the well-known impact investor, and we're anchored by the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund actually provides first loss capital for ARAF's investors. So all in all, I think we're probably a really good example of a blended finance facility. So we have equity investors through our TA facility. We also have grant providers, and also through GCF, we have first loss capital. And so in addition to the first loss capital and what it did, essentially at the time, the intentionality behind the first loss capital was to be able to crowd in additional capital, and that's exactly what it did. So we, on our investor base, it's not only the Green Climate Fund, it also includes several DFIs, including FMO and Parco. There are some European and American family offices, and there are also some international foundations, including the Soros Economic Development Foundation and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. We currently invest across 5 different countries: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Ghana. And we invest in what's called platform businesses. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that because it's quite important. And I think kind of the next iteration of what Dan was talking about in his presentation. Our typical ticket size is somewhere between 300,000 and 4 million. And so far, we've invested in 14 companies. We're done investing out of ARAF 1. I'll tell you a little bit about what we have planned for the future. But we've invested along some, fairly well-known investors in the space as well. Staying on this slide just for a moment, what we do is that what is essentially our investment strategy? We actually have taken the 20 years worth of investing in agriculture experience on the acumen side, and we found that investing in companies that provide a bundled set of solutions to smallholder farmers is actually better commercially as well as from an impact standpoint. We tend to look for aggregator models that provide bundled solutions, and so these are things supply chain optimization companies. We also look at digital platforms, and we also look at innovative financial services platforms. And I want to use this next slide to tell you a little bit of kind of why we or how we've come to this. And we now have we have more data to support what we knew strategically made sense. But now as we are starting to collect data, we have some kind of proof, if you will. If 60 decibels is on the call, they will recognize the spider chart. But basically, what we wanted to understand is for those companies in our portfolio, this is just one company, for those companies in our portfolio where farmers receive 1 or 2 services versus 3 or 4 services, how are they doing? And what we did is so you'll see 2 spider charts. I hope you can see the color differentiation. So inside this spider chart, there's a purple line. And on the outside of the spider chart, there's a green line. The purple line will to show you this is how the farmers are doing that only receive a partial set of services. So maybe 1 service or 2 services. If you look at the green line, you can see that farmers who receive the full set of services are actually doing much better off in a statistically significant way. They are doing much better off about when looking at key farming metrics. So, of course, increase in production, increase in money earned, increase in quality of life. Way of farming, which is very closely tied to adaptation, has increased significantly, and the ability to absorb a climate shock is also statistically better for farmers that receive a full set of bundled solutions from our portfolio companies. And so we have historically tried to lead with data. We continue to try to lead with data, but we just wanted to share this data point with you. It will, of course, will be included in the presentation for you to look at more closely, but I wanted to just give you an example of why, building upon what Dan said in terms of looking at the different verticals or the types of companies, our vertical, or the way that we look at it, is a little bit different. We want a company that's providing not just improved inputs, but also improved inputs, also credit, also market access. Or maybe they're providing, one of our portfolio companies, which I'll go into, they're providing after-sales support, they're providing an irrigation solution, and they're providing farmer training. So that bundle is actually really, really important, and I would be remiss if I didn't underscore that as a key component of ARAF's investment thesis for ARAF. Next slide. Okay, looks like I burned up a lot of time on that particular one. I had set my timer, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. Pre-investment, what we do, next slide, is that we actually screen all of our potential portfolio companies just to make sure that they actually have a strong likelihood of increasing the climate resilience of smallholder farmers. We work with a third party called Windrock to create this tool, and it ensures that we're not greenwashing our investments as we move them through the process. Next slide. To give you an example of what our portfolio looks like and what do climate adaptation companies look like, here are simply just the logos of the companies that we've invested in, but I'll quickly go into an example on the next slide. So we've already mentioned SunCulture, which is a solar irrigation company that designs, finances, installs, provides farmer training, and also provides after-sale support to smallholder farmers who are looking for solar irrigation solutions. What we've seen in terms of climate impact is that we see farmers who are now able to take advantage, particularly in Kenya, of 3 growing seasons instead of 2. We see a 2 to 5x increase in yields that also translates into increased income. And what we're also seeing is that farmers are able to now grow higher value crops than before. The company continues to iterate its product and services and has now maybe 3 different pumps. So that's an example clearly of a climate adaptation solution that's part of our portfolio. Next slide. The next company that is an example is this is a chocolate company called Beyond Good. They source and provide training to cacao farmers in both Madagascar and Uganda. They basically do the processing on site in Madagascar with a fully complete chocolate bar, and they sell them into high-end retailers in North America. And in that way, they provide a premium. It's all fair trade. They provide a premium to farmers. We've seen income increases as well as yield increases as a result of the services that they're providing to their smallholder farmers. I don't really like chocolate. Sorry, that's my timer telling me I'm almost done. I don't really like chocolate. Surprise, surprise, but I recognize that there's this excellent quality chocolate and the farmers are indeed benefiting from it. Next slide. Another example of a company that's in our portfolio is a company called Ibiza. They essentially provide farm weather indexed insurance to smallholder farmers, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia. And so they're providing livestock insurance, heat index insurance, flood insurance, a whole suite of solutions that again help farmers to become more climate resilient. We've just made an investment earlier this year, and I'm really excited about some of the products and the rollouts of new products that they are planning for the next couple of years. So next slide. So post-investment, once a company becomes part of our portfolio, next slide, one of the things that we do is that we work with 60 decibels to survey farmers. Every year we survey about 1,000 farmers across our portfolio to hear from them what's working and what's not. We try to understand, are their yields increasing? Are their incomes increasing? Are they happy with the products and services that they've been offered? And then we also, and because this didn't exist before, we commissioned a survey with 60 decibels to help us to understand, are farmers indeed becoming more climate resilient as a result of working with our portfolio companies? And so we basically try to understand 3 components of climate resilience. Do farmers have the skills, the stuff, and the safeguards that they need? So skills focuses on climate smart agriculture, stuff focuses on things like access to markets and credit, and the safeguards refers to things like insurance, weather-related information, access to savings and emergency funds. And next slide. So we do that survey, like I said, across about 1,000 farmers every year. And how are we doing so far? So we do a fund scorecard every year. So what we're seeing is, yes, there are the numbers in terms of lives impacted, farmer well-being. As you can see, our farmers are reporting 80% report income increases, 87% report improves way of farmings, and another 80% report increased yields. Again, you'll have time to thumb through this at your leisure. But if you look to the far right, you'll see we're also tracking changes in climate resilience over time. Some of the areas we're doing well at little by little. So the ability to adapt, which is the kind of skills, the access to enablers is the stuff. But some we're kind of doing mediocre. The ability to absorb a shock, which is kind of, do you have the safeguards that you need to absorb a shock if needed? We haven't been able to, or the companies in our portfolio through our investment haven't been able to move the needle as much, but we're still pushing on that, and it's an area of focus for us moving forward. Next slide. And my last slide, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that we are actually fundraising for our second fund. We are looking at essentially doubling everything, doubling the size of the fund from 58 million to 120, going up to 20 companies instead of 5 countries, 10 countries. Our TA facility would go up to 12 million, and instead of targeting 2 million farmers, we'd be looking at targeting 4 million farmers. Last slide. And last but not least, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about our technical assistance facility. And this is where we provide grant capital to our portfolio companies for farmer training, gender initiatives, business development initiatives, ESG, and of course our impact measurement. It's a really key component to the work that we do. It was piloted under Acumen years ago and has become a staple in all of Acumen's funds. So that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry if it took a bit longer than expected. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
No worries, Rebecca. We're right on time, and thank you. Very interesting work, very inputful work. Congratulations on that. We do have some questions on the chat, a lot of questions regarding the impact measurement part that I think you covered at the end of your presentation. So I'm going to move to other set of questions more related to the financial viability of these strategies to leverage private capital. So the first question is, how do you reconcile the small capital needs of farmers and solution providers with the minimum ticket sizes demanded by investors? And how do you calculate the capacity to absorb this capital from the investee companies and farmers?
Yeah, thank you. So we spend a lot of time before we make an investment trying to understand the business model, how the company plans to impact farmers. We actually go and talk to farmers before we invest. We try to understand essentially what is the cost benefit of analysis for a farmer. And we try to understand how much can a farmer absorb, meaning, let's say, for example, they want to buy a solar irrigation pump. We try to understand, can a farmer afford it? If he or she cannot afford it, then what is the financing structure that the company is offering, the business model that the company is putting forward to make these products and services more viable for the smallholder farmer. In terms of credit, I will say that some of our companies just offer straight up, credit. For example, with Sun Culture, they will say, okay, please make a 20% down payment, and then you can finance the rest of the asset over 3 years. We have another company in our portfolio. They have irrigation as a service, so it's a monthly payment. A lot of our companies actually will do inputs on credit. So like, I'll give you the inputs now, and then once the harvest comes, then we will reduce the amount of harvest to reflect the inputs that need to be repaid. So there's a lot of work pre-investment that goes into understanding how the company is going to use this capital and how that capital specifically will benefit the smallholder farmer.
Super interesting, and that connects with another question that someone has regarding how do farmers normally pay for these services, and how are these companies profitable? And I think it's quite interesting because when we're talking about adaptation, we don't only need to think about the provision of capital and the staff and the safeguards, but also that the capital that is being provided is not at a high expense for farmers, that they can actually absorb it, that is not on the detriment of their financial health either. I also thought that it was very interesting, the approach on the bundle solutions, and connecting with another question is, do you aggregate farmers as well? Do you aggregate not only the solutions, but also the investee companies when it's not one company that can absorb the 300K, which is the minimum ticket, but it can absorb less? Do you also aggregate those projects or companies to make them investable?
No, we don't. So we have the ecosystem we have ecosystem partners who are better able to get companies to a point where they are that they'll fit our minimum ticket size. And by the way, we never invest alone. So, let's say a company is raising $1 million, we may put in 500,000, someone else may put in 100, 250, or what have you. But in terms of kind of what we can manage, because smaller companies require a different level of support than we're able to provide. When we enter a company, we sit on the board, we provide strategic support. We will bring in consultants to help with product market fit, and a whole host of, introductions. But some of the companies that are a bit earlier stage that can absorb less money are not quite ready for the type of support that we provide. And there are great accelerators and venture studios that are much better at that than we are.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And can you provide more details about the performance of this fund? Is it profitable? Is it having good financial results? Is there a case for investors to invest in adaptation in agriculture?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I'm not at liberty to say like the returns of our fund, but what I will say is that things are going pretty well for our portfolio. All of our investors are what we call values aligned commercial investors. So they're in it for a financial return. And so we're doing our best to deliver on those financial returns. We have until 2029 to exit all of our portfolio companies. But right now, our portfolio is in good standing. And I think overall our investors are happy.
Perfect. It's great to hear. And just to close the Q&A, one last question that I thought was an interesting angle is, like, I'm going to say package two in one question. One is, are the companies that you invest in already providing bundle solutions, or that is the result also of your technical assistance and your strategic support? And connecting to that, do you have or integrate a gender lens to your investment?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, the companies before we invest, they are already providing bundled solutions. Some do extend their service offerings while they're in our portfolio, but yes, that is a criteria for our initial investment. And from a gender standpoint, what we do for our portfolio companies is that we actually collect data and then we aggregate that data or disaggregate that data by gender, and we give our companies a snapshot of the female farmer experience. We work through 60 decibels to be able to aggregate and disaggregate that data, and we work with them to understand how can any statistically significant differences between the male farmer and the female farmer experience potentially be addressed through our technical assistance facility that we make available to them. So we do, kind of show them the problem if there is one, and we do find that about 2/3 of our portfolio companies have a statistical significant difference based upon gender, and we do try to provide either support by way of consultants and or grant capital to help them to address any disparities.
Thank you, Rebecca. Great example of a specific blended finance structure. I was going to say private fund, but it's public-private fund that is viable, that has proven the case to invest in adaptation in agriculture, in emerging economies. So a lot of success in the fundraising for the second fund, and hopefully an expansion in other regions like Latin America and Asia. Now we move to our last speaker, Tony Shiaka. He is private sector investment manager of Rwanda Green Fund, and he will share an overview of Rwanda Ireme Invest and their approach to climate smart agriculture. Welcome, Tony, and over to you. You have 10 minutes.
If you could have the presentation put up. Slide. Yes, thanks. So as a country in Rwanda, we decided to essentially put up a vision of Vision 2050, which basically means that the country will become carbon neutral by the middle of the century. We also set up a national strategy for transformation, NST1, which is a cross-sectoral coordination effort to ensure the smooth implementation of environmental policies and regulations. And as part of our indices, our national climate contributions, the country has made it to reduce emissions by about 8% by 2030 compared to business as usual, which translates to about 4.6 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. In terms of financing this, the country has dedicated about $5.7 billion to do emission reduction, and then about $5.3 billion to do adaptation, climate adaptation. In terms of fund mobilization, we're able to mobilize about $4.6 billion of this amount, with the remaining amount to be raised between now and 2030. We also have the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy, which is a way to ensure that the country reaches its emissions targets and its resilience targets. Next slide. Yes, so in terms of what we've been able to achieve as a fund, we've been able to raise about $300 million in financing, and then we've had about 37,000 hectares of watershed protected, and with about 107,000 households provided access to off-grid clean energy. This could mean both through solar systems and through improved cookstoves, which reduce deforestation in the country, as about 90% of the population currently accesses energy for cooking through firewood. Then we also have about 25,000 hectares of land that are protected against soil erosion because of the country's topography. There's a lot of erosion that goes in the country, which means that we're able to reduce these erosion practices, and then through moderate landscape restoration, and we've also had some two investments that have been carried out over the past 10 years, with about 55,000 hectares of forestry and agroforestry coverage implemented, and also had about 183,000 tons of CO2 equivalents avoided. In terms of green job creation, it's also another important element of our operations, which means that we were able to create about 198,000 green jobs, which we ensure that the composition of 60% women and 40% male. In terms of investments in these sectors, we've been able to, through one project called Green Chumbi, invest in certain areas to ensure climate change adaptation, which includes about $12.6 million through watershed protection and forestry and agriculture, where we address climate risks through appropriate land use, and then also promote agricultural practices that minimize erosion and then protect and restore landscapes and improve ecosystem in the vicinities of these agriculture areas. We've also basically also supported sustainable forestry management through an investment of about $5.3 million, which assists forest owners and users to improve forest productivity and reduce deforestation to improve access to a wide range of forest products. And also, we also had climate resilient settlements where basically we recognize, which is the typical of the country, they need to locate some of these people who are in high-risk zones and high-risk areas. So that was an investment of about $9.3 million to reduce exposure to settlements, reduce exposure to landslides and flooding, and build climate resilient vulnerable households. And also in terms of knowledge transfer, we've made an investment of about $3.2 million to basically communicate awareness and the need for improved seeds, for example, the need for improved cultural systems and cultural practices, and then scale up these practices across the country. In terms of impacts in the field, through this project, we've been able to basically do about 1,200 hectares under soil erosion through the conservation terraces, and about 450 hectares of protected forestry, and about 21,000 green jobs and 6 post-harvest facilities constructed, as well as mass and rehabilitation for water management and efficient usage. Then, in terms of the private sector, my next slide. In terms of next sector, we basically created the Invest project, which is basically investment specifically for the private sector in Rwanda. Other partners between the Green Fund and the Development Bank of Rwanda, where we would handle the project facility, and then basically transform projects from feasibility to bankability, where they're able to access credit lines with the Development Bank of Rwanda. Next slide. So this is the structure of the facility. We have under the Green Fund, we have basically what we call the project facility, which provides 3 different types of financial instruments. We have equity investments. This one is limited up to $1 million investments, and then we have the capable grants, which can go up to $300,000 and then can be repaid with a 2-year grace period. So that means the initial first 2 years, they don't have to make any repayments. And then they have basically up to 5 years to make the repayment. Can be done in multiple tranches or a single tranche. It's all negotiated, and we analyze the ability of the business to pay back. The good thing with this one is that at the end, if the company is unable to repay the amount back, we just convert it into equity holding the business, such that there is no liquidation of assets, and we're able to basically provide the project with additional patient capital to go from the PPF stage up to the success liquidity facility. We can also provide traditional non-capital grants of about $100,000. And in this case, we also provide some technical assistance in some cases, where we provide assistance on creating business models and the technical aspects of the business, in terms of marketing, in terms of accessing additional forms of finance. And then once that's completed and the business is feasible, it moves on to the credit facility handled by the Development Bank of Rwanda, where they provide loans of up to $10 million and bank guarantees of up to $1.5 million. In this case, the coverage for the collateral is up to 50% for traditional businesses, and for female majority-owned businesses can go up to 70%, meaning that we're also encouraging investments in the sector. In terms of what we've been able to do in terms of climate adaptation, one of the things we've done basically is support projects aimed at mitigating climate change. So projects that do working in water management, infrastructure to help local communities adapt to climate conditions. And then we've also been promoting sustainable agriculture by providing improved seed crops that are more climate resilient and drought resilient, especially in the eastern region, which is very which is prone to increases in temperature and droughts. And then we've also basically supported some irrigation practices in solar irrigation. We've also basically done some water conservation management projects to basically improve water supply to these local agricultural communities, and then restoration and forestation. And then also strengthen disaster relief and resilience, where we basically provided financing to help local communities to access agro insurance. So that's both for flooding instances and also for cases of drought. And then once these communities were able to see the positive upsides of having this kind of insurance, they were able to basically see the importance of it, and they were able to spread the circulation and use of these insurance policies and practices. Then we've also had a lot of capacity building and awareness programs that have shown a lot of the local communities in improving the ways of performing the cultural practices, which has basically improved the baseline performance in these sectors. And then through our private sector engagement, in partnership with the Bill Gates Foundation, we basically launched a cohort of projects that are supporting private sector adaptation, climate adaptation and agriculture projects, which is allowing a lot of businesses to basically to be able to access financing as well as technical assistance in terms of improving the business structures and improving the productivity and the resilience to the climate change. So that's it in a nutshell in terms of the green fund and its placement in the private sector.
Thank you so much, Tony. This is yet another very concrete example of a blended finance structure being used in the service of climate goals, both mitigation and adaptation. We received also a few interesting questions on the chat. First, maybe a question very straightforward. Have the de-risking mechanisms proven to be effective? For instance, the guarantee, and do you see it mobilizing interest from private investors? And are these private investors private, or domestic, like Rwanda private investors, or more international?
So yeah, it has been successful in bringing private sector finance, and on top of that, most of it has been local. So the investments that are being supported here in this space are basically local investments, and they seem to be interested. Obviously, the plan is to eventually scale it up so that we also get to attract additional investment and interest from international markets. In terms of that, also the rest of that. And as a country, we've also worked on that to be able to raise a couple of green bonds that have been, oversubscribed in a matter of 2 weeks, which means that there's additional capacity and potential for raising foreign capital for these green bonds. Then we've also been working also with additional partners on trying to identify businesses that are looking at selling green corporate bonds. And we have a couple of them in the pipeline, and hoping to basically close down these deals and raise this capital.
Perfect. And I love this example because it proves the case, and it proves that it is effective also to mobilize these private actors that are sometimes harder to bring on board because they lack the knowledge, they lack the risk perception that is fine-tuned in this new asset class, if you wish. So this is a great example to prove that there is actually a way to structure this to make it viable. And we're coming close to an end. We have only 2 more minutes, but I would like to wrap up with one last question for you, and is, how do climate adaptation benefits connect also with climate mitigation, biodiversity, and social benefits? Because you were mentioning also the great impact that it has had in terms of avoided or reduced tons of CO2 emissions. So what types of solutions bring multiple benefits on the ground?
Yes, thanks. So one that has really been very effective in the market is solar irrigation, which basically, because the implementers have been using just relying on the national rains, which is just traditional subsistence farming. So that time basically has created a lot of improvements in terms of resilience for this sector, especially in the eastern region of the country, which are very prone now to droughts. In fact, like since 1979, the temperature has increased by about almost 2 degrees centigrade. So that is a significant increase. Obviously, reduces the opportunity of the equator. What this also does is basically allows the local solar companies to also be able to develop once they're supported, and so they're able to basically replace in other areas where it's existing and have to get financing. They're able to basically see the impact and reduction in terms of operation use, and then they're able to displace the traditional diesel generator companies. basically bring about a change in markets and paradigm shift in operations.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you,
One
Dan.
more is,
Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead,
sorry,
go ahead.
yeah. So another thing is that we had some developments in the market. Seeing the importance of adaptation. One of them is that the country basically has removed bans on GMOs, obviously, which is basically going to allow much more resilient seeds to be able to in the market and provide improved productivity for the local farmers.
Thanks. And I think it's super useful also to show the spectrum of solutions, because as Dan pointed out in the first presentation, the solutions are very context specific, even location specific, and it can vary from farm to farm, from crop to crop, from ecosystem to ecosystem. So this is very enlightening and valuable to close and wrap up this webinar with this. Thank you, Tony, again. Thank you, Dan and Rebecca. This was very valuable. It showed that there is a need and there is a case to invest in adaptation in agriculture across the world. And we invite you to join the last webinar of the series, which is upcoming on the next September 17th, if I'm not mistaken. So over to the Climate Links team if you want to wrap up.
Yes, just echoing what Maria said. Thank you all for joining us again. We're so excited you were here for part 3 in our 4-part webinar series on climate finance. And yes, as a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be posted on climatelinks.org in the coming weeks. And we hope you'll join us for the final webinar in the series on scaling financing for climate innovation, the role of climate ventures and accelerators, next Thursday, September 19th. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.